Today, we will be discussing the paper, Letting the Deaf Be Deaf, reconsidering the use of cochlear implants in prelingually deaf children. In this paper, Robert Crouch argues that there are cases in which cochlear hearing aids should be refused by parents of prelingually deaf children. To start, let's define what some of these things are. Cochlear implants consist of an outer device that picks up sound and a surgically implanted device that directly stimulates auditory nerves. Prelingually deaf children are children that are either born deaf or become deaf before full acquisition of language, usually before they turn 1. In this paper, Crouch begins to argue that even if cochlear implants work perfectly 100% of the time, an argument could still be made for refusing them. However, he states that though some might consider this argument more interesting, he will argue his point given the current effectiveness of cochlear implants. The premises of Crouch's argument are as follows. Premise 1. Cochlear implants rarely succeed in incorporating prelingually deaf children into hearing culture. Premise 2. Cochlear implants deprive deaf people of deaf culture and language. Premise 3. Deafness is not inherently worse than not being deaf. The conclusion is as follows. In some cases, cochlear implants should be refused. First off, we should determine if this argument is valid. I think this argument is valid because when premises are accepted as true, the conclusion must be true. Next, we must determine if this argument is sound, which means we must determine how Crouch supports his premises. For premise number 1, that cochlear implants rarely succeed in incorporating prelingually deaf children into hearing society, Crouch provides a decent amount of support. He argues that for an individual to be incorporated fully into the hearing society, they must meet certain criteria. The child must be able to 1. Hear and identify speech, 2. Produce intelligible speech, and 3. Acquire an oral language, which incorporates 1 and 2 together. Crouch then argues that cochlear implants for prelingually deaf children only rarely get them to this point. He quotes several studies that show that even though the implants help the children somewhat, they usually don't get the children far enough to really incorporate themselves into the hearing society. Crouch acknowledges that there might be some cases that are complete successes, but that for the vast majority, these implants do not work in acquiring the children verbal language. For the second premise, Crouch argues that the use of cochlear implants turns prelingually deaf children away from the opportunities to learn American Sign Language and other sign languages and become part of a deaf culture rather than a hearing culture. Crouch supports this argument less strongly than the first, mostly relying on unsupported statements, but he does include a quote from a deaf child. Learning through an interpreter is very hard. It's bad socially in the mainstream. You are always outnumbered. You don't feel like it's your school. You never know deaf adults. You don't belong. You don't feel comfortable as a deaf person. Which illustrates this point quite well. Crouch argues that trying to fit deaf children into a language that doesn't fit them is worse than teaching them a language that was designed by and for deaf people, and letting them become part of a group, which he argues is better than being an outsider in hearing culture. However, Crouch fails to prove sufficiently that the use of cochlear implants really prevents prelingually deaf children from ever learning sign language or joining deaf culture at some point. The third premise is strongly connected to the second, in which Crouch argues that the treatment of deafness as a disability causes deafness to be seen as objectively worse than having hearing, and that this assumption leads to deaf people losing out in language support and support in general. Crouch states that because of sign language in the deaf community, being deaf is only different than being able to hear, not worse. I think this is the worst supported argument, and it might not be an argument at all, because it seems more like a critique of the disabled distinction of deafness and its effect on the deaf community. Crouch only brings this up because the fact that deafness is seen as a disability incentivizes the use of cochlear implants, which further diminishes the deaf community, and does nothing to stop the disability assumption. Crouch argues against this circular diminishing of deaf culture because he believes that incorporating prelingually deaf children into deaf culture and teaching them sign language is more valuable than trying to teach them spoken language and incorporating them into auditory culture. Perhaps the third premise should be changed to, quote, deaf culture and language are better for prelingually deaf children than auditory language and culture. Our new argument is as follows. Premise 1. Cochlear implants rarely succeed in incorporating prelingually deaf children into hearing culture Premise 2, cochlear implants deprive deaf people of deaf culture and language. Premise 3, deaf culture and language are better for prelingually deaf children than auditory language and culture. Conclusion: in some cases, cochlear implants should be refused. However, I think that this final premise is questionable. Crouch tries to support this claim by showing how the deaf community is like an ethnic or cultural community, but seems to ignore his previous points about how deafness is not incorporated well into education. Crouch acknowledges that these things are bad and need to be fixed, but fails to incorporate these things into his argument that cochlear implants should be refused. Crouch tries to say that life for deaf people, especially in the educational system, is not ideal, but still advocates against treatment that may help a child be able to hear. Although it seems that Crouch's argument is not entirely sound, I still think that his general ideas are worth considering. His argument against deafness being considered as a disability is strong, and his advocacy for fair treatment of deaf children in the education system is noble. These systems and injustices are the very things that lead people to use cochlear implants, as there would be no need for them if deaf children received the same level of education and treatment. A concept having to do with this topic that is important to consider is this: when should any human trait be considered a disability, and should this determination factor how well the trait is supported in our world today? For example, a deaf person born into a society of deaf people, all using sign language, would not be considered disabled in this context. Similarly, someone who we would consider average or normal, born into a society of superheroes, might be considered disabled due to the fact that he or she does not have superpowers. When we look at disability this way, we can see that it is determined by whether a person is able to perform what a quote-unquote average person can perform. Therefore, disability is determined by the state of the world surrounding the individual. When Crouch states that he wants deaf people to not be considered disabled, I think that he is trying to state that the deaf community is significant enough with its establishment of language and culture that a deaf person could join them and not be considered disabled. Crouch could also be saying that he wants the deaf community or the entire world to be this way. We also shouldn't ignore the effect of calling a group disabled that can have on the growth and opportunities of said group. Even though being deaf in an auditory culture might technically make one disabled, it is still worthwhile to try and avoid that designation, as it often leads to that group being ignored by the general population, which only helps the idea that they are disabled. In conclusion, the fact that deaf people might be defined as disabled is somewhat irrelevant, as it only harms the deaf community's potential to grow and support other deaf people. Acknowledgement that deaf people, with support of the deaf community, can live perfectly good lives helps us in making the lives of deaf people as whole even better. I think this is the real purpose of Crouch's paper.